I stood silent when my daughter called me a parasite at my sister's funeral. Her voice cracked against the stained glass windows, slicing through the mourners' prayers. People shifted, ashamed to meet my eyes. Behind her, my brother Graham lingered, arms folded, gaze sharp as a blade. My sister Eliza had left me 250 acres, 400 cattle, a Cadillac, and every reason to be hated. But what no one saw was the letter tucked in my pocket, written in her steady hand before she died. It carried a truth powerful enough to burn everything my family thought they knew. The church smelled of lilies and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clings to grief. Eliza's casket rested at the front, her photograph propped beside it, sunlight breaking through the stained glass windows to catch her smiling face. The room was heavy with whispered prayers, the shuffling of restless feet, and the brittle weight of unspoken judgments. I stood near the aisle, my hands clasped so tightly they ached, when Savannah rose from her seat. Her heels clicked against the stone floor, sharp and deliberate. She turned toward me, her eyes burning, her lips pulled into the kind of smile that wasn't joy, but venom. "Parasite," she spat, her voice cracking against the vaulted ceiling. The word rippled through the congregation like a stone dropped into still water. I felt every gaze tilt toward me. Some widened in shock, others narrowed with suspicion. My daughter's voice rose clear and merciless. "She doesn't deserve the vineyard. She doesn't deserve the land, the cattle, the car, or the money. She took everything from Aunt Eliza. She's never worked the soil, never cared for the vines, never fed a single cow. She is nothing but a parasite." A woman in the front row gasped, covering her mouth. The priest shifted uneasily, his hand tightening around his rosary. Even the organist froze, fingers hovering above the keys. The silence that followed her words was alive, thick, a noose tightening around my throat. I did not speak. I did not flinch. Shame crawled hot up my neck, but I stood rooted, still as the vines Eliza once tended in morning fog. Inside, something harder than grief pressed against my ribs. I had felt it growing for years, through estrangement, through whispered judgments, through the abandonment of a child who once called me mother. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, Graham, my brother, standing at the back of the church, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't speak, yet it felt like he had orchestrated the entire scene. Savannah's fury wasn't spontaneous, it was staged, sharpened, fueled by him. My breath caught as I realized this was no outburst, it was a trap. The service staggered forward, awkward and broken. The priest stumbled over his words, his voice quivering as he tried to steer the focus back to Eliza's life. But the damage was done. Every mourner carried Savannah's accusation in their eyes. Some avoided looking at me entirely. Others stared too long, as if measuring guilt by silence. When the final hymn ended, people filed past the casket, whispering condolences that tasted of pity more than comfort. Savannah walked out without a glance in my direction, her lawyer close behind. Graham remained at the back, his gaze never wavering. He gave the smallest tilt of his head, a gesture that might have passed as grief to anyone else. To me, it was confirmation. He had set the fire and was watching me burn. Later, when the church emptied and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Martin Pike approached me. His suit was dark, his expression colder than usual. "Nora," he said softly, as if speaking too loud might shatter me. "Your sister wanted this handled privately, no theatrics." He carried a leather folder under his arm, and I followed him into a side room where the scent of polish gave way to dust. He opened the folder, his voice steady as he read Eliza's will. All land, assets, livestock, personal property and financial accounts are hereby transferred in full to my sister, Nora Whittaker. The words landed like stones in the still air. Everything, every acre of vineyard, every head of cattle, every cent was now mine. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, my chest tightened. This wasn't triumph, it was weight. When Martin closed the folder, he handed me a small sealed envelope. My sister's handwriting curved across the front, familiar and precise. I traced the letters with my fingertip, my throat tightening. She asked that you read it when you're ready, Martin said. His eyes searched mine, not for weakness, but for resolve. I nodded, slipping the envelope into my pocket. It felt heavier than the folder, heavier than the casket at the altar. I knew without opening it that Eliza had left me more than land and cattle. She had left me a truth, one that could either anchor me or tear apart whatever pieces of family remained. And in that moment, as the last light bled through the stained glass, I understood something chilling. Savannah's outburst had been the opening blow, but Graham's silence was the true declaration of war. Morning broke with a veil of fog rolling low across the vineyard, the vines half hidden like secrets refusing to surface. I sat on the back porch of the cottage, a chipped mug of black coffee warming my hands. The wood beneath my chair was damp with night's condensation, and the air smelled faintly of soil and lavender. Beside me, Cole Ramsey, Eliza's vineyard manager for over 2 decades, leaned against the railing with his thermos. His eyes followed the fog as if it carried answers. "You know this isn't over," he said finally, his voice rough from years of early mornings and too many cigarettes. Savannah's tantrum wasn't just grief. It was staged. Someone fed her those words. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The image of Graham's cold stare in the church lingered in my mind. His silence had been louder than Savannah's shouting. Cole sipped his coffee, then set the thermos down with a soft thud. "He'll come after you. Maybe not himself, but through paper, through courts. He's always been that way, never swinging fists, always pulling strings." The weight of his warning pressed down on me, but beneath it was something else, a strange steadiness. For years I had been bracing against storms, against abandonment, against being cast aside by the people meant to hold me close. This storm would be no different. By mid-morning, the crunch of tyres on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A white courier van rolled into the drive, its side door rattling. The driver, a young man in a crisp uniform, stepped out with a leather satchel and a clipboard. His polite smile didn't reach his eyes. He looked as though he carried more than paperwork. "Delivery for Ms. Whittaker," he said. I signed where he pointed, my hand steady, though my heart pressed harder against my ribs. He left as quickly as he arrived, the van's engine fading into the fog. I carried the envelope inside, its weight disproportionate to its size. Cole followed, his jaw set tight. The seal tore easily, too easily, and inside was a thick stack of documents, bound with brass fasteners. At the top, bold letters read, "Petition for temporary injunction and estate freeze." Graham's name appeared in sharp black ink on the signature line. His attorney's letterhead glaring from the margin. My pulse slowed, heavy and deliberate. Cole cursed under his breath. "It's begun," he muttered. I skimmed the language, allegations of undue influence, claims that I was unfit to manage a vineyard, suggestions that Eliza had been coerced. It was the kind of legal attack designed not to win on merit, but to bury me under doubt, paper, and time. Then midway through the packet, I saw it. A photograph, clipped neatly between affidavits. My breath caught. The image showed Savannah in a navy dress, standing in a law office, her expression tense but composed. Beside her, unmistakable, was Graham. His hand rested on the back of her chair, his body angled toward her like a shield. The date stamp in the corner read 2 days before the funeral. I set the photo on the table, the edges biting into my fingertips. Cole leaned over, his brow furrowing. So it's true, he's the one holding the reins. The room tilted slightly, not from shock, but from recognition. All along, I'd wanted to believe Savannah's rage was hers alone, born of old wounds between us. But here was proof. She was a weapon Graham had sharpened. He had orchestrated her betrayal, set the stage, so I would be cut down in public. Cole placed a steady hand on my shoulder. You can't ignore this. He's not going to stop until he's gutted everything Eliza left you. I folded the photo back into the packet, then pressed the brass fasteners shut as if sealing something dangerous. The shame from the funeral still lingered, but it burned differently now, less like humiliation, more like fuel. I won't let him, I said, my voice low, steady. The fog outside began to thin, sunlight filtering through in fractured beams. For the first time since Eliza's casket was lowered, I felt a strange kind of clarity. Graham had declared war, not with fists or shouts, but with silence and paper, and I would meet him on both fronts. I set the packet aside, the unopened envelope from Eliza still resting in my pocket. That letter, I knew, carried something Graham had never accounted for, her voice, her truth, her trust in me. And when the time came, it would be the sharpest weapon I had. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar smoke when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't hurried, not the pounding of urgency, but 3 deliberate taps that carried confidence. Cole was out in the fields, and I knew before I opened it who would be standing there. Graham. He filled the doorway with the same broad-shouldered presence he had carried since childhood, though now it was draped in a tailored suit rather than overalls. His face bore the appropriate solemnity of mourning, but his eyes gleamed with something else, calculation. "Sis," he said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for my invitation. "I thought we should talk. Family to family." I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't even motion toward a chair. But he seated himself anyway, folding his hands neatly on the table as if he belonged here. He began with pleasantries, speaking of Eliza, of loss, of how difficult transitions like this could be. He spoke as though he were the elder brother guiding me through a complicated season. His tone was warm enough to fool a stranger, but to me it was the warmth of a snake coiled in the sun. "I don't want conflict," Graham said finally, reaching into his briefcase. "What I want is stability. For you, for Savannah, for the family name. Eliza's estate is large, more than you can manage alone, and frankly, more than you should carry alone." He slid a folder across the table. The papers inside were crisp, pre-signed in places, tabs marked with coloured flags. "I've spoken with council. Here's a proposal. You transfer half the acreage to me. I'll handle the cattle. There's a buyer lined up. Good price. You keep dime the house, a portion of the land, and, of course, the Cadillac. It's fair, balanced. You get peace of mind, I take the burden. Everyone wins." His words dripped with reason, but underneath I heard the verdict. "Give it up, or I'll take it another way." I looked down at the folder, the vineyard, the cattle, the land Eliza had entrusted me with. reduced to contracts and signatures. Graham had planned this long before Eliza's heart stopped beating, maybe even before her diagnosis. I lifted my gaze and met his eyes. No, his brows arched slightly, as though he'd expected resistance, but not simplicity. Nora, think carefully. You don't know the first thing about managing operations of this scale. I'm offering you freedom from chaos. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I pushed the folder back toward him, then reached for it again. My hands did not tremble. I carried it to the fireplace, still glowing faintly from the morning's fire. Without ceremony, I tossed the papers into the flames. The edges curled instantly, ink warping into blackened scars. The fire devoured the contracts with a hiss. For a moment, silence pressed against us. Then Graham leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a slow smile. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even surprise. It was satisfaction. You always were predictable, he murmured. The sight of that smile chilled me more than any shouted threat could. He hadn't wanted me to sign. He had wanted me to refuse. The contracts had been bait, not a solution. And by burning them, I had stepped neatly into his second plan, whatever it was. You think you've won something, he continued, rising smoothly from the chair. He adjusted his cufflinks as if he were preparing for a meeting rather than leaving a battlefield. But the truth, Nora, is that you've already lost. You just don't see it yet. He walked to the door, pausing with one hand on the frame. I'll be in touch. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room thick with smoke and the acrid scent of charred paper. I stood by the fire, the glow flickering across my hands. The contracts were gone, but his smile remained. I realised then that Graham hadn't come seeking compromise. He had come to set the stage. Whatever plan he had waiting, this had only been the opening act. The ashes drifted upward, disappearing into the chimney's throat. And with them, I felt the weight of a warning. The real fight was still ahead. It began quietly, like a rumour slipping under a door. A link forwarded by a neighbour, a screenshot texted by someone from the co-op. By midday, the whispers had swollen into a storm. The headline spread across phones and laptops. Local woman manipulates dying sister into changing will. Vineyard legacy at risk. My name was there, printed in bold. The article claimed I had coerced Eliza in her final days, exploiting her grief and frailty to seize control of the estate. It painted me as a vulture circling above a dying woman, waiting to feed. At first, I stared at the words without absorbing them, my mind buzzing with static. But the more I read, the colder my chest became. The piece was slick, written with just enough half-truths to catch a reader off guard. It spoke of my estrangement from Savannah, twisting it into proof of my unfitness. It mentioned Eliza's medical treatments, insinuating that I'd hovered too closely, pressuring her decisions. The most damning piece was the photo. It showed me sitting at Eliza's hospital bedside, holding her hand. Her eyes were closed, her face drawn with pain. The caption read, "Final hours, final influence." But the truth was simpler. It had been weeks before her passing. She had been resting after a difficult treatment, and I had simply sat beside her, waiting for her to wake. No words about wills, no whispers of manipulation. Just a sister sitting with another. Yet the photo told a different story when paired with the article. Cropped and framed, it made me look like a schemer hovering over the weak. By evening, the piece had spread across every corner of Sonoma. Anonymous comments filled with bile, neighbours posting subtle digs online, whispers from people I'd known for years. Their eyes no longer carried pity, they carried suspicion. I sat in the kitchen, the glow of my phone screen throwing sharp shadows against the walls. My hands tightened around the device until my knuckles whitened. A knock at the door broke the silence. When I opened it, Ruth Delgado stood there, her silver hair pulled back, a brown paper bag of peaches dangling from her wrist. She stepped inside without waiting, setting the bag firmly on the counter. "You need to see this," she said, pulling out her phone. She opened a browser and tapped the source code of the blog. Lines of text, technical, confusing, except for one line Ruth had highlighted in yellow. A publisher's tag. "It's hosted by Whitaker Strategies," she said flatly. "Graham's company." The room tilted, of course it was. "He wants you discredited before you can even settle into the estate," Ruth continued. "If the town believes you manipulated Eliza, if they see you as greedy, then his injunction gains power. Judges listen to public perception more than they admit." I sank into a chair, my fingers pressing against my temple. "He staged Savannah's outburst. Now he's writing my villainy into history." Ruth's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp. "And he won't stop. This is step 2 of a longer plan, but he made a mistake." She zoomed in on the metadata attached to the hospital photo. "This image wasn't taken by any of his people. It came from hospital staff, which means he has someone feeding him from the inside. If we find who, we prove manipulation." Her words steadied me, but the photo still burned in my mind. The betrayal of something tender turned into evidence of corruption. I thought of Eliza's envelope, still unopened in my drawer. Did she know this would come? Did she sense that Graham would twist even her last days into a weapon? I closed my eyes, breathing through the weight pressing on my chest. Around me, the kitchen smelled of peaches and smoke, of sweetness layered with ash. "Let him write his story," I said finally, opening my eyes. "Because when the truth comes, it won't whisper. It will roar." Ruth studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Then we fight not just in court, but in the court of public opinion." Outside, the wind rattled the vines against the window. The land felt restless, as though it too sensed the lies spreading across it. And in that restless hum, I felt a pulse of resolve. Graham had turned the community against me, but he had also revealed his hand. And that meant his mask would not hold forever. The night was long and airless, the kind where silence pressed too tightly against the windows. I sat at Eliza's old desk, its surface scarred with rings from wine glasses and ink stains from decades of letters. The envelope she had left me lay unopened beside a brass key. I had carried it in my pocket since the funeral, its weight shifting with every step. Finally, with hands steadier than I expected, I turned the key in the lock of her safe. The door creaked open, releasing the smell of paper and dust, a scent that felt like memory itself. Inside were stacks of neatly labelled folders, Eliza's handwriting precise as ever. Beneath them, tucked in a slim leather case, lay a small digital recorder and an envelope addressed to me. My throat tightened as I pulled them out, the paper warm from the safe's stale air. The letter came first. Eliza's familiar script flowed across the page, strong despite the tremor I knew had plagued her hand in the last months. "Nora," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and Graham has already started circling. He pressed me to alter my will, to sign papers that would divide the vineyard, the cattle, the house. I refused. He grew angry. He called me a fool. I fear he will not stop now that I'm gone. But I trust you. You carry the land in your bones, even if you do not believe it yourself. Tears blurred the ink as I folded the letter. I pressed it to my chest, the paper stiff and fragile like brittle leaves in autumn. Then I reached for the recorder. The click of the button filled the room with a faint hiss before her voice came, soft but steady. "This is Eliza Whittaker," she began, as though she were giving sworn testimony. "I want this on record. My brother Graham has approached me 3 times, pressing me to amend my will. He insisted that Nora could not manage the land, that it should be split or sold. I refused each time. He became agitated. The last time, he threatened to bring Savannah into the matter. I am making this statement so there can be no doubt about my wishes. The vineyard, the cattle, the accounts, they belong to Nora." Her words struck like a gavel, firm and undeniable. But then her voice faltered, softened into something that carved me open. "I know Nora has doubts," she said. "She told me once she wasn't sure she had the strength to run the vineyard alone. She worried the weight would crush her, but I know her heart. She endures. She is more rooted than even she realizes." The recording clicked off. I sat frozen, the silence after her voice louder than any storm. Relief surged through me. Here was proof, undeniable, that Graham had tried to manipulate her, and that Eliza had refused. But braided through it was something dangerous. She had spoken the truth about me, my fears, my hesitation. If Graham got hold of this recording, he would twist it. He would turn my private confession of doubt into evidence of incompetence. I played the recording twice more, memorizing every pause, every breath. It was a shield, but also a blade that could cut both ways. By morning, I called Daria Chen. She was young, sharp, relentless, the kind of journalist who saw through facades like smoke. When she arrived at the cottage, she carried a camera bag and a notebook worn from use. I placed the recorder and letter on the table between us. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing, her pen moving in quick strokes. When the recording ended, she looked at me. "This is dynamite," she said. "If the public hears it, it destroys Graham's narrative." "And if they hear the part about my doubts?" I asked. She paused, considering. "Then it becomes a battle of framing. He'll try to spin it." But the weight of Eliza's words, her refusal, her clarity, it's stronger. "Trust me, Nora. Truth cuts sharper than spin." Her confidence steadied me, though unease lingered. As she packed her equipment, she glanced back. "He'll come for this. He'll try to bury it or twist it, but we'll be ready." When she left, I sat alone again, the recorder resting like a loaded weapon on the table. Eliza had given me a gift, but also a burden. The proof I needed to fight Graham was in my hands, yet so was the seed of doubt he could use to destroy me. I pressed the recorder's button once more, letting her voice fill the room, anchoring me to her faith. And I whispered into the empty air, "I won't fail you, Eliza, not again." The town hall smelled faintly of dust and old pine, its wooden beams groaning as neighbours filled the seats. Farmers, merchants, vineyard hands, faces I had known all my life, gathered with the uneasy curiosity of a crowd waiting for spectacle. The air hummed with whispers, the scrape of folding chairs, the flicker of camera lights from local reporters. At the front, a portable screen glowed pale blue. Daria stood beside it, her voice sharp, carrying across the room without need for amplification. "What you are about to see," she said, "are unedited clips and documents that speak for themselves." The screen shifted, and the image of Eliza's funeral filled the hall. Savannah's voice echoed through the speakers, her words slicing the room again. Parasite. People shifted, uncomfortable, hearing it outside the sanctuary where it first landed. Then the footage widened, capturing Graham at the back of the church, watching silently, his expression cold. A ripple of recognition ran through the crowd. Next, Daria displayed a series of emails. Projected in bold letters, they bore Graham's name and the header of Whitaker Strategies. The words were damning: negotiations with an out-of-state developer, discussions of parceling the vineyard into luxury estates, plans to liquidate cattle for quick profit. Gasps spread. A man in the third row muttered, "Selling us out." A vineyard worker shook his head, his fists tightening in his lap. Daria closed her notebook. This is not speculation. These are Graham Whitaker's own words. This is what he intended for Eliza's land. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tide turn. Faces that had once looked at me with suspicion now burned with outrage. But not at me, at him. Cole stood, his voice steady. "I worked this vineyard for 25 years. Eliza never once spoke of selling. Nora may not know everything yet, but she's learning. And she's willing. That's more than Graham ever gave." Others followed. Ruth rose, her sharp tone cutting through the murmurs. "I served on the bench for decades. What I see is manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. The law will follow, but tonight the community must speak." A vineyard hand who had laboured under Eliza for 2 decades stood up, his voice trembling. "This land fed our families. It deserves better than to be stripped and sold." Daria raised her hand. A symbolic vote. "All in favour of supporting Nora Whitaker as rightful steward of Eliza's estate. Raise your hand." Hands shot upward. Row after row, palms lifted like a field of vines reaching for sun. My chest tightened, tears threatening as I watched even hardened skeptics raise their arms. For a heartbeat, the room pulsed with unity, with faith. Then the lights dimmed, flickered, and another video played, not Daria's doing. The image shifted to Savannah. She sat in a dim room, her hair pulled back, her face pale. Tears streaked down her cheeks as her voice cracked. "She made me leave," Savannah sobbed. 8 years ago, my own mother told me I wasn't welcome. She shut the door on me, on my family. She said I was nothing. I begged her for help, and she turned me away. The room went silent. Her words fell heavy, splintering the unity that had just taken root. People shifted, their raised hands faltering, lowering slowly into laps. The clip ended abruptly, the screen going dark. For a moment, the only sound was the low murmur of doubt rising like smoke. "That's not the whole story," I said, my voice carrying across the room, but the damage was done. Whispers rippled. Some eyes that had softened toward me moments ago now hardened again, uncertain. Daria looked furious. "It's spliced," she hissed under her breath. "Cut from different interviews. They faked the context." But the crowd wasn't analysing edits. They were reacting to the raw emotion on screen. A daughter's tears, a mother's supposed rejection. It was easier to believe in betrayal than in complex truth. Graham emerged from the back of the hall, slow and deliberate, as if timing his entrance for maximum effect. He said nothing, only offered a small, pained shake of his head. The gesture was enough. To the crowd, it looked like grief. To me, it was triumph. My stomach sank. Victory had been within reach, the community's faith ready to anchor me. And in seconds, Graham had unravelled it with a single clip. The symbolic vote remained unfinished, hands hovering mid-air, caught between belief and doubt. The room, once charged with clarity, now fractured under his lie. I stood frozen, Eliza's letter still tucked in my pocket, her faith pressing against my heart like armour. But even armour could feel heavy in the face of tears. The morning after the town hall, the story spread like wildfire. Clips of Graham's emails flashed across local news sites, his negotiations with developers laid bare for everyone to see. Comment threads swelled with outrage. He would have sold us out. Eliza trusted the wrong brother. Even the wine co-op board moved quickly, issuing a statement before noon. Graham's name, once touted as a pillar of the local industry, was struck from their rolls. By afternoon, one of the major investors he had courted pulled out entirely, their letter terse and final. We cannot proceed with any development under current circumstances. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply. The vineyard air tasted lighter, less burdened. Cole found me by the lower fields, his boots sinking into damp soil. "You see," he said, almost smiling, "truth's got longer legs than lies." I wanted to believe him. That evening, I returned to Eliza's desk. The safe still stood open from nights before, its contents a mix of order and ghosts. Among the files, I found a sealed envelope marked not for me, but for the Whitaker Foundation Board. My hands trembled as I slit it open. Inside was Eliza's familiar script, deliberate and firm. To the board, under no circumstances is my brother Graham Whitaker to be included in any management or decision-making capacity related to this vineyard, its land, or associated funds. His involvement would endanger the integrity of what has been built. Trust instead in Nora, who may doubt herself but carries the heart required to endure. I let out a shaky breath. Here it was, Eliza's judgment, unclouded, written weeks before her death. With this letter, Graham's attempts to claw his way into authority would crumble. The paper felt like steel in my hand, the final piece locking the door against him. I carried it to Martin Pike the next morning. His eyes scanned the letter, his lips pressing into the faintest curve of satisfaction. "This is airtight," he said. "He can scream, file motions, stir the crowd, but legally he's cut out." For a fleeting moment, I felt steady, strong, but storms never warn you before they shift. That afternoon, as I sat with Ruth on the porch, her phone buzzed with a notification. She frowned, then handed it to me. On the screen was Graham's face, broadcast on national television, framed by the polished glow of studio lights. The chyron beneath him read, "Betrayed brother speaks out, family legacy in jeopardy." I turned up the volume. His voice filled the air, rich and mournful. "My sister Eliza and I built our lives on this land," he said, his expression grave. "In her last months, I begged her to consider fairness. Not for me, but for our family, for Savannah, for the next generation. But Nora, she shut me out. She's always shut me out. I wanted partnership. Instead, she left me with ashes." The interviewer leaned forward. "You're saying your sister's will doesn't reflect her true wishes." "I'm saying Nora manipulated her," Graham answered softly, his voice cracked, perfectly timed. "I loved Eliza. I wanted to protect what she built. But Nora has twisted everything into power for herself. And now my own daughter won't even speak to me because of her influence." The camera zoomed closer, capturing the sheen of unshed tears. It was performance, but masterful. Ruth swore under her breath. "He's flipping the script. National stage, sympathetic lighting. It won't matter what we show. People will see what they want to see. A grieving brother." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Just hours ago, victory had felt tangible. Now the tide shifted again, the narrative bending under Graham's practiced hands. Online, the clip spread faster than the town hall footage. Commentators debated on morning shows. Headlines blared, "Family feud over vineyard splits county." Strangers who had never walked our fields spoke with authority about motives, about betrayal. Cole slammed the newspaper on the kitchen table the next morning. "He's poisoning the well. You had them in your corner, and now—" His words trailed off, frustration heavy. I stared at Eliza's letter, still clutched in my hand. The ink was steady, her faith unwavering. Yet my heart felt unmoored. Graham had been cast out, legally, but in the court of opinion, he was back at the centre, painting himself as the wounded brother, the wronged man. And once again, I was the villain in a story I never wrote. The envelope from the district attorney's office arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a clerk with tired eyes. I signed the receipt, my fingers numb, and opened it at the kitchen table where Eliza and I once ate toast as children. Summons for deposition. The words stared up at me in sharp black ink. They wanted me to bring every piece of documentation: Eliza's letter, the recorder, the emails Daria had verified. The paper carried the weight of inevitability. Graham's performance on television might have swayed hearts, but the law now demanded evidence. 2 days later, I walked into the courthouse with Martin by my side. The marble floor gleamed beneath harsh fluorescent lights, every step echoing louder than I wanted. My arms were heavy with folders, neatly labelled and clipped in threes, each piece of proof Eliza had left behind. When I handed them to the clerk, I felt a measure of relief. The truth was no longer just mine to carry, it was entered into record, locked into the system Graham thought he could manipulate. But fate rarely allows victories without clause. During the proceedings, a witness I hadn't expected appeared. An older man with a worn suit and a gravelly voice, introduced as a former planning commissioner. He spoke slowly, each word dragging like stone. "I was approached by Graham Whittaker 3 years ago," he said. "He offered compensation, cash, campaign donations, in exchange for leniency on rezoning parcels near the vineyard. He wanted options open should he gain control of the land." The courtroom buzzed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras whirred. Martin's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Here it was, proof that Graham's hands weren't just dirty, they were soaked in corruption. For a moment I let myself breathe, but Graham never stayed cornered. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall. His voice softened into wounded sincerity. "Your Honour, I respect these proceedings, but I must raise a serious concern. My sister Nora has exhibited signs of instability, severe stress, erratic sleep, emotional outbursts. I worry she is not mentally fit to manage an estate of this size." The words cracked through the room like a whip. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the judge, ignoring me entirely. "She has admitted doubt about her ability to run the vineyard. She isolates herself, refuses family support. I fear for the land under her care. It deserves steady stewardship, not someone unravelling under grief." Murmurs rippled across the chamber. Reporters perked up like vultures scenting blood. One even left mid-session, phone already pressed to his ear. I sat frozen, my palms slick against the table. Martin bristled beside me, objecting sharply, but the damage was done. Graham hadn't needed evidence. He'd planted a seed of suspicion, and the press would water it until it bloomed. By evening, the headlines appeared. Mental fitness of vineyard heiress questioned amid family dispute. Whittaker legacy at risk as sister shows signs of strain. Every word felt like a blade, slicing through the small victories I had managed. The letter from Eliza, the commissioner's testimony, all overshadowed by whispers of instability. Neighbours who had raised their hands for me in the town hall now looked away when we passed on Main Street. Some gave polite smiles, too quick, too brittle. Others muttered under their breath. The vineyard hands still stood by me, but even they shifted uncomfortably when talk of mental fitness reached the fields. That night, I sat in the dark of the cottage, the recorder clutched in my hand. Eliza's voice filled the room once more, speaking of Graham's pressure, of her faith in me. But my ears caught only the line that could undo me. She told me once she wasn't sure she had the strength to run the vineyard alone. I pressed pause, silence flooding back. Graham hadn't needed to hear the recording. He had already found my weakness. Doubt. Cole found me on the porch, staring at the fog. "They'll twist anything," he said quietly, "but the land doesn't care what the papers write. It just waits." I nodded, though my chest felt hollow. The land might wait. But the world, it seemed, had already decided I was cracking. And Graham, smiling behind his mask of grief, had managed once again to turn victory into ash. The headlines still lingered like smoke, but I refused to let them choke me. I had spent too long reacting, too long standing in defence, while Graham dictated the terms of every battle. It was time to build something of my own, something that could not be undone by whispers or staged tears. At dawn I sat at Eliza's desk, her quilt draped across my shoulders. The papers before me were not contracts of surrender, but blueprints of creation. With Martin's guidance, I signed the documents that restructured the estate, not as a prize to be divided, but as a trust, a living foundation. The Whitaker Women's Renewal Fund. Its mission was simple: to give women over 50, widows, divorcees, the abandoned, a chance to rebuild, to learn the soil, to mend vines, to carry themselves into futures they had been told were finished. It would be Eliza's legacy made larger, extended beyond blood. When I placed the final signature on the page, something shifted inside me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt less like prey and more like rootstock. Scarred, yes, but ready to sprout again. By afternoon, I gathered the vineyard staff in the long hall. They came hesitantly, shoulders heavy from weeks of scandal. Faces that once looked to me with quiet support now bore lines of worry, exhaustion. Cole stood at my side, his presence a steady anchor. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing against the beams. "This vineyard will not be sold," I began. "It will not be carved into estates. It will live, and it will grow, not just grapes, but opportunity. Starting this season, we'll host sustainable agriculture programs for women rebuilding their lives. It's not charity, it's strength. It's Eliza's gift carried forward." Murmurs rose, soft at first, then swelling with something I hadn't heard in weeks: cautious hope. One of the older vineyard hands, her hair silver beneath a sun hat, raised her hand. "And our jobs, will they stand?" "They stand," I said firmly. "No one loses their work. In fact, we'll need more hands to guide the women who come. You won't be replaced. You'll be mentors." Relief rippled across the room, shoulders easing, lips curving into small smiles. For a moment, the weight of suspicion lifted. After the meeting, volunteers began to sign up. Neighbours, retirees, even 2 former students of Eliza's from her early days in viticulture. They offered weekends, evenings, whatever time they had. It felt like light breaking through storm clouds. Yet even light casts shadows. Among the sign-ups was a man I didn't recognise. Younger than most, his handshake firm, his smile polite but too practised. His name was listed as Daniel Price. He claimed to be a local agronomist looking to volunteer his expertise. Cole frowned when he saw the name. "Never heard of him," he muttered. "And I know just about every farmer in this valley." But Daniel blended easily, offering help with irrigation checks, asking questions about harvest schedules, jotting notes into a small leather notebook he carried everywhere. To anyone else, he was simply eager. To me, there was something too polished about him, like a mask that fit a little too neatly. That night, as I sat on the porch, the vineyard stretched quiet and endless before me. I thought about Graham's smile by the fireplace, the way he'd seemed satisfied when I burned his contracts. Daniel's sudden appearance carried that same echo, like another stage being set. The twist settled cold in my chest. Graham wasn't done. He had found a way to place eyes within my walls. I clenched Eliza's letter in my hand, its words steady, even as mine faltered. Trust yourself. Endure. So I would. Even as shadows crept closer, I would root deeper. The following week, the long hall, once used for vineyard meetings, echoed with a different kind of energy. Instead of ledgers and contracts, the tables held soil samples, pruning shears, seedling trays, and stacks of notebooks. The first group of women had arrived, 6 in total. Their faces were marked by lines of age and hardship, but their eyes carried something brighter, an ember of possibility. I had invited Rosa Alvarez, a widow who had once built a thriving jam business from nothing, to help lead. Beside her stood Janine Walker, a former teacher who had been quietly pushed out of her school after a bitter divorce scandal. Both women knew reinvention not as theory, but as survival. Rosa demonstrated how to graft a vine, her hands moving with the calm precision of someone who trusted the soil. Janine guided the women through notes on seasonal cycles, explaining when to prune, when to water, when to simply wait. The 6 women listened with rapt attention, some scribbling furiously, others simply watching as if afraid to miss a breath. I lingered at the edge of the group, my chest tightening with something I hadn't felt in months, hope. This was what Eliza had seen in me, what she had trusted I could carry forward. Not just grapes, not just cattle, but lives rekindled, futures restored. As the lesson moved forward, one of the 6, an older woman named Marjorie, shifted uneasily in her chair. Her hands trembled around her notebook. Suddenly her pen clattered to the floor and she buried her face in her palms. The room fell silent. "I can't," she whispered through her tears. "I can't do this." Rosa moved toward her, but Marjorie shook her head violently. Her words tumbled out in a rush, jagged with shame. "He paid me," she said. "Graham. He promised money if I came here and made trouble, if I questioned everything, if I stirred doubt. I thought I needed it. I thought I had no choice." Her voice cracked. "But I can't lie to these women. I can't lie to you." A chill swept the room. The other women looked at one another, their expressions shifting from shock to anger to quiet resolve. I stepped forward, my own heart pounding, but not with rage, with clarity. I knelt beside Marjorie, gently pulling her hands from her face. Her eyes were wet, her cheeks flushed with shame. "Look at me," I said softly. She hesitated, then lifted her gaze. "You came here," I continued. "You sat with us, you listened, you admitted the truth. That takes more courage than Graham will ever understand. You don't owe him. You don't owe anyone who seeks to use your desperation as a weapon." Marjorie sobbed harder, shaking her head. "I don't deserve to be here. Yes, I said firmly. You do. This place isn't about perfect beginnings. It's about broken ones. Stay, learn, grow with us. That's the only way he loses, when the people he manipulates refuse to be his tools. Slowly, Marjorie nodded, her breath shuddering as she straightened in her chair. Rosa set a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone, she said simply. The room shifted then. What had been a moment of near collapse transformed into something stronger. The other women leaned closer, offering small touches of support, a hand on Marjorie's back, a murmured reassurance. What could have been division became unity, sharper and brighter than before. I stood facing them all. This is what he fears, I said. Not me, not my name, not the deeds in a folder. He fears this, women standing together, refusing to be broken, refusing to be bought. The words weren't rehearsed, but they rang through the hall with a weight I hadn't intended. The women nodded, their eyes alive with something fierce. When the session ended, they lingered, sharing pieces of their stories, losses, betrayals, debts, silences. Each tale carried echoes of my own. By the time they left, their steps were lighter, their shoulders less bowed. As the last one departed, Cole stepped into the hall. He had been standing in the doorway, listening quietly. You turned his knife into a plough, he said, his voice low with admiration. I looked around at the tools, the soil, the lingering warmth of voices that had once been silenced. For the first time in weeks, the vineyard didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a beginning. But in the back of my mind, I could still see Graham's smile the night I burned his contracts. He hadn't expected me to fold. He had expected me to fight, which meant he had already planned his next move. And this time, he would aim deeper. The first whisper came from a folded flyer left on the counter of the local grocery store. By noon, copies appeared on cafe bulletin boards, slipped under doors, pinned to fences. The title sprawled across the top in elegant script. Whitaker Heritage Initiative. Preserving Legacy, Empowering Futures. At first glance, it looked legitimate, even noble. The brochure promised mentorship programs, sustainable farming classes, and grants for women in transition. But the logo was not mine. The photographs were stock images, and the listed address traced back to an office suite in San Francisco. I spread one of the flyers across Eliza's desk, my stomach sinking as I scanned the fine print. Application fees, $500. Consultation sessions, $250 an hour. Payments funneled into Whitaker Strategies. Graham. He hadn't just built a false narrative this time. He had built an entire false institution, a shadow cast over the very trust I had created. To the untrained eye, the Heritage Initiative looked like an extension of my work. To those desperate for help, it would feel like hope until the money vanished. Ruth was at the cottage within the hour, her jaw set hard as she read through the brochure. "He's overplayed," she said, her voice clipped. "This is fraud, plain and simple. I'll draft a cease and desist tonight." By evening, the local paper carried the headline, "Community warned of potential scam, Whitaker Heritage Initiative under scrutiny." The article quoted Ruth directly, calling Graham's actions predatory. For a brief moment, I felt a flare of vindication. Perhaps finally his schemes would collapse under their own greed, but the relief shattered when Martin dropped a folder on the table the next morning. "You need to see this," he said grimly. Inside were leaked documents, internal notes from Whitaker Strategies. My eyes caught on one page, highlighted in yellow, Board of Founders, Graham Whitaker, Savannah Reed. My breath froze. Savannah. My daughter's name listed as co-founder, her signature scrawled beneath in familiar handwriting. The room tilted, the paper trembling in my hands. Martin's voice cut through the fog. It doesn't matter whether she signed willingly or he forged it. The damage is the same. To the public, it looks like Savannah has chosen Graham's side. It frames you as divided not only from your brother, but from your own child. The betrayal landed sharper than any injunction, any headline. The trust I had built was more than legal. It was emotional, symbolic. And now the image of mother and daughter split across opposing fronts would poison it. Cole slammed his fist against the doorframe. He's dragging Savannah into the mud to make her the face of his con. People won't see the scam, they'll see family fracture. I stared at the page, at my daughter's name twisted into a weapon. Memories flooded, her laughter as a child, the day she left without a goodbye, the funeral when she spat venom into the air, and now this, co-founder, aligned with Graham. It wasn't just a financial trap anymore, it was personal annihilation. By evening, reporters called relentlessly, asking for statements. Do you deny your daughter's involvement? Is the feud between you and your family deepening? Every question carried the same implication. Even her daughter stands against her. I refused to answer. I would not let them draw blood from wounds already raw. That night, I sat alone in the hall where women had just begun to find hope. The tools were still scattered across tables, notebooks left half filled with lessons on soil and sunlight. It all looked fragile now, as if one strong gust could scatter it like ash. I thought of Marjorie's confession, of the strength born from forgiveness. Perhaps this too could be turned, but the ache was real, sharper than before. The twist of betrayal came not from Graham's fraud, but from seeing my own child's name used to legitimize it. I pressed my palms against the desk, steadying myself. Eliza's letter remained in the drawer, her words still whispering, "You endure, and so I would." Even if my brother dragged my daughter into his war, even if the town turned again, I would hold. Because this was no longer about land or cattle or even legacy. It was about truth. And truth, however battered, does not die. The harvest day dawned golden, the kind of morning Eliza used to call a forgiving sun. Rows of vines shimmered under light mist, heavy with fruit. By mid-morning, women began to arrive, 32 in total, filling the long hall with chatter and laughter. Some brought baskets, others tools borrowed from neighbours. They came not just to learn, but to belong. We worked side by side in the fields. Rosa showed a younger woman how to test a grape's ripeness by pressing it gently between her fingers. Janine explained the rhythm of pruning, her hands moving with a teacher's ease. The air rang with voices, not hushed with suspicion, but alive with curiosity. Women who had been strangers only hours before leaned together, trading stories of loss and survival. I moved among them, answering questions, tying vines, offering encouragement. Every smile I saw stitched something back into me, each laugh a thread mending the wounds Graham had tried to tear open. For the first time since Eliza's funeral, the land felt alive with joy rather than grief. At lunch we gathered under the oak trees. Sandwiches were unwrapped, jars of Rosa's jam passed around, laughter rolling like music across the vineyard. I sat quietly for a moment, listening, watching. This was what I had fought for. Not contracts or headlines, but this. Soil under nails, women finding each other in the work of renewal. The afternoon sun began to dip, gilding the vines in amber light. That was when I saw her. Savannah. She stood at the edge of the field, her figure thin against the glow. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair pulled into a hasty knot. The steel that had carried her into the funeral was gone. In its place was exhaustion, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She approached slowly, each step hesitant, as if the ground itself might reject her. The laughter around us faltered, women glancing between her and me. "Mom," she said, her voice raw, stripped of the venom it once carried. "I don't want money, I don't want land. I don't know where else to go." The air thickened, the vineyard suddenly too still. I studied her face, searching for the performance I had grown accustomed to. But there was no fire, no sharp edges, just ruin. "I can't undo what I've done," she whispered, "but I need a place to stand." For a moment my chest ached with the old longing, the mother's instinct to gather, to shelter, to forgive. Memories rushed back, Savannah as a child running through the vines barefoot, her laughter ringing like bells. My arms yearned to close that distance, but I saw too the brochure with her name beside Graham's. The courtroom whispers, the headlines, the years of silence she had chosen before Eliza's death. I drew a slow breath. "Savannah," I said, my voice steady, "I want you to heal, I want you to rebuild, but not here. Not on this land, not in this trust. This place is for those who come without chains. And you are still bound to him." Her face crumpled, tears streaking her cheeks. "So there's no place for me?" "There's a place for you in the world," I said softly, "but not as long as you're standing in his shadow. Not until you find your own light." Silence stretched. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the road, her shoulders bent under invisible weight. I stood rooted, my hands trembling at my sides. The women around me shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. They seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, the line I had drawn, the wound that could not be erased. As the sun sank lower, I felt a prickle at the edge of my vision. On the far hill, just beyond the fence line, a figure stood watching. Tall, broad-shouldered, arms folded, Graham. Even from a distance, I could see the tilt of his head, the smug stillness of a man who believed the game was far from over. He had sent Savannah to me as his broken envoy, and now he observed the aftermath, calculating his next strike. I met his gaze across the field, unflinching. He wanted me shaken. He wanted me desperate, but I would not give him that victory. Still, as the last light bled from the sky, I knew one truth settled deep as roots. Graham was not finished. This had been merely a prelude, and his final blow was already on its way. The letter arrived in an envelope so old-fashioned it looked out of place among the stacks of legal notices and utility bills. The handwriting on the front was neat, almost delicate, but the name caught my breath. Miriam Calloway. Miriam had been one of Eliza's closest friends decades ago, a woman who had co-managed a small winery before retiring to Mendocino. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Inside the envelope, her words spilled out in crisp ink. "Nora, I've been following the news. I can see what you've been through, how the vineyard has nearly been torn apart. Eliza always said you had more grit than you believed. I have a parcel of land in Mendocino, too much for me to manage now. I'd like you to take it, not as an inheritance, but as a trust, an extension of what you are building. Make something honest out of it." For the first time in months I laughed. Short, sharp, but genuine. Graham had tried to fracture my foundation. Yet here was another piece, being added, not taken. When I drove north to Mendocino, Miriam met me at the edge of the property. She was older now, her hair completely silver, but her eyes had lost none of their clarity. "Eliza would have wanted this," she said simply, handing me a folder with the deed. "Don't waste it on lawyers and grief. Plant something worth keeping." The land was smaller, harsher soil than Sonoma, but a creek wound along its border, and the rows of dormant vines seemed to whisper of possibility. I placed my hand on the earth, and, for the first time since the funeral, I felt not just burden, but possibility. Weeks later, during the first gathering of the women's circle at Mendocino, a little girl named Nova, Janine's granddaughter, stood shyly at my side. She carried a tiny seedling in a clay pot, her boots 2 sizes too big. "Can I plant it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Together we walked to the southeast corner of the vineyard, where the soil was rich and dark. Nova dug with her small hands, pressing the earth carefully. She lowered the seedling into place, whispered something I couldn't catch, and patted the soil firm. When she looked up, her face glowed with pride. "Now it's ours," she said. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Yes, Nova, now it's ours." The circle applauded softly, and I realized Eliza's legacy had expanded beyond bloodlines. This land, these women, this future, it was no longer just mine to carry. It belonged to all of us. For a brief fragile moment, joy pulsed through me, but Graham was never far from shadows. The very next morning, newspapers carried a new headline: "Whitaker heiress sells Mendocino parcel to developers. Community betrayed again?" Attached was a photocopy of a contract, my supposed signature scrawled at the bottom. I froze, bile rising in my throat. It looked real, too real. But before despair could sink its claws into me, Martin stormed into the cottage, a stack of files under his arm. "Don't panic," he said. "We've been waiting for this." He spread the documents across the table. Emails, wire transfers, drafts of contracts. "The DA already has evidence. Graham forged this agreement weeks ago, hoping to spring it when you were vulnerable. What he didn't know is that one of his associates turned witness. They traced the payments, the edits, even the forged notary stamp. He built his own noose." Ruth entered moments later, holding a freshly stamped order. "The district attorney's office is filing charges as we speak. Fraud, forgery, attempted misappropriation of trust assets. He won't wriggle out this time." Relief crashed through me so suddenly my knees nearly gave way. I sank into a chair, the forged contract trembling in my hands. Graham had tried to script my downfall once again, but this time his own hand had betrayed him. Outside, the sun was rising, casting the Mendocino vines in gold. Nova's little seedling swayed gently in the breeze, fragile but rooted. For months I had fought against shadows, each attack a fresh wound. But now, as the DA's case solidified, I realized the truth. I didn't need revenge. Graham had undone himself. My work was no longer to fight him. It was to build what he could never touch, a future seeded in truth, watered in resilience, and grown by hands that had been broken but refused to stay down. Eliza's voice echoed in my memory, "You endure." And as the vineyard stretched before me, alive with new beginnings, I finally understood what she meant. The barn was lit with strings of lanterns, their warm glow spilling across rows of chairs and long tables lined with bread, fruit, and bottles of last season's wine. It was the first annual gathering of the Whitaker Women's Circle, and the hall buzzed with voices. Women from across the valley, from Mendocino, even from counties further south, had come to celebrate the harvest and the beginning of something larger than any one of us. When I stepped to the front, the room hushed. Faces turned, Faces marked by years, by hardship, by endurance. They waited not for spectacle, but for truth. I took a breath, my hand brushing the brim of Eliza's vineyard hat. "This land," I said, my voice carrying steady through the rafters, "was once a battlefield, a place where lies were planted, where betrayal took root, where blood ties became chains. But today it is no longer a field of war. It is a table. And there is room for every one of you." The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in cheers that shook the beams. Women rose to their feet, clapping, laughing, some even crying. The words had not been polished or rehearsed, but they had come from the soil of my chest, raw and honest. Ruth stood in the back, her silver hair catching the lantern light, a rare smile softening her face. Cole raised his glass, his eyes steady with pride. Rosa squeezed Janine's hand, and little Nova sat on her grandmother's lap, beaming. It was Eliza's dream, carried forward, not through contracts or inheritance, but through flesh and spirit. Outside, as the celebration swelled, the world beyond the barn was shifting too. Graham's name flashed across headlines again, but this time not as a victim or a brother wronged. The district attorney had filed formal charges: fraud, forgery, and attempted misappropriation of trust assets. Investors severed ties, boards removed him quietly, and his face disappeared from glossy profiles. He had not come to the gathering, nor would he ever. His silence was not retreat, but exile. And for the first time I felt no urge to chase, no desire to watch him fall further. He was already gone, undone by his own hand. Later that night, when the tables were cleared and laughter drifted into the cool September air, I walked to the carport. The Cadillac gleamed under the lantern light, its hunter green paint still pristine. I slid behind the wheel, the leather seat sighing beneath me. The engine roared to life, smooth and familiar, and I drove the back roads of Sonoma with the windows down. The vines rolled past in rows of shadow and silver moonlight. The air smelled of dust and grapes and something freer than victory. When I returned home, I pulled out my journal, the one I had kept hidden since Eliza's death. For months, its pages had been filled with grief, rage, the scars of betrayal. Tonight, the pen moved differently. I refuse to carry hatred any longer, I wrote. I will not wear revenge like a cloak that never warms. I plant a future, not for Graham, not even for Savannah, but for those who came tonight, for those who will come after. I plant it for myself, for peace. I paused, my hand trembling not with fear, but with release. Eliza gave me the land, but what she truly gave me was the chance to choose what to grow. I choose this: roots, not chains, tables, not battlefields, futures, not grudges. I closed the journal and set it beside the candlelight. Outside, the vines rustled softly in the night wind, steady as breath. For months I had waited for reconciliation, for some final confrontation, for closure. But closure was not what I needed. Graham's downfall was not my triumph. Savannah's absence was not my wound to mend. The twist of truth settled into me like rich soil. There would be no reunion, no dramatic forgiveness, no cinematic revenge. There would only be this: peace, a peace Graham would never touch, never understand, never corrupt. I stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin. In the distance, Nova's seedling swayed gently, rooted, reaching. And for the first time since Eliza's funeral, I felt whole.